Democrats are calling for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from any case related to the events of January 6th. The growing calls come after it was revealed that his wife, Virginia Thomas, sent text messages to then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging him to challenge Donald Trump's 2020 election loss. Thomas would send 29 texts in total. The majority of the message were about how the former president could overturn the results of the election. Well, here to talk about this is Ed Espinosa, the president of Progress Texas, and James Dickey, CEO of J.D. Key Communications. James Dickey, does Justice Thomas have a conflict of interest?
Not specifically in terms of general stuff, but he is the kind of justice who would be likely to take the high road. And if there is an apparent conflict of interest, he probably will step away on a specific issue. The issue, though, is how broadly this is being presented. This is being presented that because his wife has an opinion, he should either shut down her opinion or he should be stopped from doing anything. Somebody should have thought about that with the Biden family when Biden was running for president, if that's going to be the standard we're going to live under.
Okay. Ed Espinosa, do you think Justice Thomas should recuse himself from any January 6th cases or any other cases?
You know, regardless of how people feel about Justice Thomas, whether you agree with his positions or disagree with his positions, we should all be able to agree that if his spouse is sending text messages in support of the insurrection, that is a conflict of interest if you are hearing cases pertaining to the insurrection and the investigation of it. So, yeah, I do think he should recuse himself from these cases. And if he's the type of justice to do that, great. And if he's not the type of justice to do that, then I think that's one of the reasons why the Supreme Court should have some sort of ethics commission to look into these sorts of things. But he absolutely should recuse himself from anything here. He has a conflict of interest.
James, should text messages from the spouse of a justice be grounds for recusal?
So that is a really touchy scenario. In fact, I'm surprised more feminists have not stepped up to say, what do you mean this husband should control what this wife is saying in her line of thought? I mean, imagine if that had been the standard with the Clinton Foundation or with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State and Bill was out saying things that were different, or when Bill was president and she was out saying things that were different. The difference in standard is really what's kind of striking. But there is a federal statute, Section 145, that does apply, including to the Supreme Court. And I have no doubt Justice Thomas will do the right thing if it is a specific viable thing, not just something his wife thinks.
Okay. And finally, Ed, should a person be held accountable for the text messages from that person's spouse?
No, and I don't think that's what this case is about at all. What the case is about is how close the justice is to the person who is a party of the case or who is a party to some element of the case. It's not about controlling what text message this person sent. It's the fact that he has a relationship with a person who sent text messages communicating with the chief of staff, and that Justice Thomas is the only justice of the 9 justices to vote against releasing documents pertaining to the January 6th investigation. Not only does he have a conflict of interest, his performance so far demonstrates that he is carrying out, he is ruling along the lines of what is apparently a conflict of interest.
Okay, well, so far there isn't a case to make this a necessary issue just yet, but who knows? We got to wrap it up. James, Ed, thank you both very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.